Good morning. Hasn't this been great so far, right? And there's lots more to come. It is now my honor to introduce a dynamic TV and radio personality and a refreshingly independent voice. Michael Smerconish is the host of a daily radio program on Sirius XM Channel 124, the host of CNN's Saturday morning shows, a newspaper columnist, and an accomplished author. He has been a contributor on all the major networks and a guest on virtually every national television program where politics is discussed. Michael Smerconish has received numerous awards as one of the nation's best and most important talk show hosts. And he is one of the few who has interviewed 5 different presidents. Michael is the author of 6 books, 2 of them New York bestsellers. I find it particularly impressive that he donated all of the author proceeds for 3 of these manuscripts to charity. Although he is now an independent, Michael got his start in Republican politics as an 18-year-old college student, advance man for then Vice President George H.W. Bush. And at age 29, he was appointed by then President George H.W. Bush to a sub-cabinet level position where he reported directly to HUD Secretary Jack Kemp. After his stint in politics, Michael practiced law for 10 years before turning to broadcasting as his full-time endeavor. Michael now lives in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania with his wife and 4 children. Will you please join me in giving a warm welcome to the stage, New Way, California's special guest, Michael Smerconish.
Thank you for that. That was awfully nice. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kristen. Ladies and gentlemen, last year, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger invited me to his home. He wanted to talk political polarization and smoke cigars. And for me, it gets no better than that. Please don't tell my wife. This was a purely social call. But as he was speaking, my wheels were turning because he was talking about subjects that are important to me, gerrymandering and polarization and the like. I desperately wanted to record some of that audio for use the following day on my Sirius XM radio program. I asked him and he agreed. The only thing I had with me was my iPhone, by the way, and as I recall, an enormous chocolate Labrador was seated next to the governor, and I had to push the dog off to the side so that I could sit close enough to record the audio on my iPhone. And as he was speaking eloquently about the subjects that bring us together here today, I had a dilemma. Because this was a Monday, 2 days removed from President Trump having awakened at 6 o'clock in the morning and sending off 5 successive tweets where he said that President Obama had tapped him at Trump Tower. Inexplicably, there was a 6th tweet that took a cheap shot at Governor Schwarzenegger. Now, I was his house guest. I didn't want to offend the Terminator, of all people, but I thought I'll be derelict in my duty if I don't ask him, why is President Trump so obsessed with you? And so I mustered up the courage and I asked the question, and he leaned into me and he said, "It's because he loves me." And his eyes told me, end of conversation, and I moved on. You won't be surprised to hear that the following day, that comment went absolutely viral. Worldwide headlines about the mix-up, the dust-up between these 2 entertainment and political titans. And I was a bit embarrassed at having asked the question. I thought I'd taken the bait, because for me, it was a great illustration of just how hard it can be to command people's attention for the all-important subject of our partisan divide. Oh, they covered gerrymandering and polarization, but they did so in about the 8th or 9th paragraph. That needs to change, because as we are all in agreement on here today, the nation's in crisis. And I base that on 30 years of observation and involvement that I've had. As Kristen mentioned, I've been privileged to have a front row seat as both an observer and a participant. Partyism exceeds racism today. No showing of hands, but how many of you, think about this now, would be disappointed if a son or daughter came home and said they were marrying outside of political party? When that question was asked in 1960 of Americans, only 5% of Republicans, only 4% of Democrats said they would be displeased. When that question was asked again in 2010, half of Republicans, 49%, 33% of Democrats said they'd be displeased. When UCLA's political science professor Lynn Vavreck reran the numbers in 2016, it had gotten even worse. Meanwhile, acceptance of interracial marriage had risen to 86%. So today, Americans would rather that their sons and daughters marry outside of their race than they would their party. Partyism is the new ism. And there are many causes. And I know that chief on the governor's list of causes, and I agree with them in this regard, although I don't put it number one for reasons I'll explain, geography, the gerrymandering. It's gotten absolutely out of control. And you could say, well, it's been around for a long, long time. I'm tempted to joke that it's the world's oldest profession, except that title's been taken. Hey, this is my best material I'm using here. I say, thank you, Governor. But what's made it different is the use of big data, right? Big data allows them to draw those maps now down to every nook and cranny and cul-de-sac. I am so pleased that on Monday, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld a new map for my home state of Pennsylvania that will reduce the impact of gerrymandering. But that's why there are so few competitive congressional districts in the country. 435 congressional districts, and only 37 of them have the presidential race decided within 5 percentage points. 98% reelected. 402 of the 435 were decided by more than 10 percentage points. That's all because of gerrymandering, and I applaud what California has done in that regard under your leadership. But there's something else that's going on out there that's not explained just by gerrymandering. Blowout counties, not congressional districts that have their lines redrawn every 10 years, but blowout counties are growing exponentially. There were darn few of them as recently as 1992, but the vast majority of our counties in this country are now being determined by more than 20 percentage points. The 2016 election was much closer than the 1992 race, and yet if you compared the maps, and if I were to show them to you colorized, you'd see far more blowout counties in the election that was just concluded. Here's a different way to look at it. My favorite illustration of the problem of what I'll call self-sorting, and this is David Wasserman's work at the Cook Political Report. Donald Trump won 76% of counties with a Cracker Barrel, and only 22% of counties with a Whole Foods. Now, Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel, I think largely based on the data with which I'm so familiar, don't often build in the same area. I happen to have one of each in my neck of the woods, and I live in a swing county. But typically they build according, I think, largely to political demographics. Well, there was a 54% gap between the showing in Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel country in the most recent election. If you go back to 1992, that gap was 19%. It has grown steadily and progressively since that time. Geography, gerrymandering, self-sorting, all contributing to the partisan divide. So too is technology. You know, we love the gadgetry, but people get beer muscles when they're able to go online and say things that they would never say if you could see their face, and then hide behind their identities. I'm the father of 3 sons. In my era, in high school, we used to have what were then called dates. So you would call her home, maybe on a rotary dial or a push-button phone, and you'd pray that the old man didn't answer the phone because you'd have to talk your way through him in order to get to her. I look at my sons today. They sit back and they seem to get it all done with their thumbs. But they're being raised, hopefully not mine, devoid of social skills. You know, I worry when it's time to ditch the technology and get out into the real world if they'll be able to sustain a conversation and act in a civil fashion. There's something else that technology is doing. It's allowing us too easily to reach out and associate with the like-minded. There was a great book a couple of years ago by a fellow named Bill Bishop called The Big Sort, where he anticipated this. And his theory is that in the 1960s, we disengaged as a society. Less Elks Club, less bowling league, less support of our local newspapers. And when we re-engaged as a society in the computer era, we were able to do so along much more narrowly cast lines. And the translation of that in the world in which we live is now we have Facebook friends who tend to be the like-minded. We live in echo chambers thinking we are knowledgeable and read in when, in the fact, if you're on the right, your world consists of AM talk radio and Fox and Drudge and Breitbart. And if you're on the left, it's Salon and it's Slate and it's MSNBC. And never the two seem to meet. There have been references to money. That's another contributing factor to the partisan divide that we face. You've heard of Citizens United and its progeny, this idea of nonstop fundraising. Here's the practical reality of it. Our elected officials in Washington today essentially sit Tuesday through Thursday and during a school calendar year. The rest of the time, they've got to race home and raise funds. And what that has to do with incivility and partisanship is the following. They don't have a cocktail with one another. They don't break bread with one another. They don't know one another. And it's far easier to demonize someone with whom you have no relationship. Better that they'd all live in Washington, D.C. and spend all their time in D.C. and go old school where the kids actually attended schools in Washington, D.C. The 1980s were not that long ago. We had partyism, but not polarization. Ronald Reagan, two-term Republican president of the United States at a time when Tip O'Neill was the Democratic Speaker of the House. They had a good relationship. Reagan hosted Tip O'Neill at the White House for his 69th birthday, and he proposed an old Irish toast that went something like this. He said, "Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't have one too, I'd throw mine away and go to hell with you." Now, can you imagine Boehner and Obama, even Ryan and Trump, having that kind of a moment of warmth? No. Bias, a driver of our partisan divide. But I'm not thinking Republican versus Democratic bias. I'm not thinking liberal versus conservative bias. At the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, they looked at the 2016 presidential election every single day as it was portrayed through the national news sites. They found that both candidates were covered negatively. Trump's coverage was 77% negative. Hillary's coverage was 64% negative. There was not a single week when either of them was in positive territory. So the real bias, it seems to me, is that the media, whether warranted or not, is constantly seeking out the negative story and putting that in front of the American people. But finally, and this is where I come back to saying I know that the governor puts at the top of the list gerrymandering, and I think that's so important. But if you were to say to me, how did we get where we are today? I would say, and this may sound strange coming from someone who earns his keep in front of a microphone, but it's the loudmouths. It's the loudmouths among us who have driven us into a ditch. Media personalities who don't give a damn about good governance. They care about attracting ears to radio programs and eyes to TV shows and mouse clicks to websites, all with a profit motive. Great illustration is this guy, Alex Jones. Alex Jones, who has a phenomenal following on YouTube. Alex Jones, who says that Sandy Hook was a hoax and that 9/11 was an inside job. Well, last summer in Austin, Texas, he was involved in a custody battle for his 3 children. His wife said he's not a stable person, and she pointed to things that he had said in the media. His lawyer said, now wait a minute, you can't hold him accountable for the things that he has said on television and radio. That would be akin to holding Jack Nicholson responsible for his depiction of the Joker in the Batman movie. And it was a confirmation of everything that I have always believed about the industry in which I work, which is that not even the guys who are spouting off about these issues believe it themselves. The only people that I meet for whom the world is entirely a left or right presentation are talk radio hosts and television presenters. Because when I'm pumping gas, when I'm at a back-to-school night, when I'm doing grocery shopping, as I split those responsibilities at home, people engage me in conversation, and the issues are a mixed bag. They're liberal on things, often social issues. They're conservative on things, usually fiscal issues, and there's a whole heck of a lot they just don't have figured out, and they're not afraid to say it. But my God, you'd never know that if you landed here from a different planet and you turned on a cable television channel. I'll tell you who gets it is Senator John McCain. I don't know if you'll remember, but after that unfortunate diagnosis with an aggressive form of brain cancer, he returned to the well of the Senate to cast a critical vote on the Affordable Care Act. There he was with a scar over one of his eyes, lamenting in front of his colleagues the passing of days when compromise was commonplace. And McCain said something, I want to quote it literally because it spoke to me. He said, "Stop listening to the bombastic loudmouths on the radio and television and the internet. To hell with them. They don't want anything done for the public good. Keywords, our incapacity is their livelihood." He knows that the provocateurs that I'm speaking of reach the most reliable voters who come out in primaries and then give us a choice, not in your top two system, but in a state like mine, closed primary state of Pennsylvania, that are representative of the fringes. And I don't like either of them. Somebody who's on the far left who's a Democrat, somebody who's on the far right who's a Republican, and no one representing where I think the bulk of the country lies, which are the 45% who told Gallup in January they're independent. The politicians aren't listening to those who matter the most, and that's the reason why. So the boundary lines are being drawn to protect parties, not people. Aided by technology, we're associating more with the like-minded. The nonstop search for campaign dollars leaves no time for breaking bread. The news we receive accentuates the negative, and the pot is being stirred by those provocateurs looking to make a buck. Depressing stuff, but not yet a reason to become a doomsday prepper. I'm here to applaud this effort today because I see signs of hope. I see the 42% of the country who were eligible and didn't vote in 2016 a disgrace, but I think they could be wooed if only they felt someone were more mindful of their considerations. Open primaries would be a step in the right direction, affording us more choice in the nomination process. Ending sore loser laws that allow a candidate who loses in a primary to come back and run again in a general election. Fixing gerrymandering, of course. My fingers are crossed for the outcome of that Wisconsin case that's currently before the Supreme Court of the United States. We can do campaign finance reform without the Supreme Court of the United States. We need full and immediate disclosure of all campaign dollars, and we ought to have that in an internet world. And finally, we've got to take back the debate from the provocateurs. Here's a great sign of how bad it has gotten, and it comes from my home state of Pennsylvania. In Scranton, last year, the local YMCA removed the 24-hour cable stations from the gym. Lifetime Fitness, I think, has done this in some locations this year. They sent out a letter to all the members, and they said that channels, I have to say it, like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox have given rise to intense confrontations which have raised concerns about the safety, both physically and emotionally, of our members. That's how bad it's gotten. I'm not for removing any cable stations. I want people to change the channel. You know, here's the irony. Never in our history have we been afforded so much choice, and yet so few of us seem to be exercising it, and that's got to change. Here's my final thought. Thank you. I hope your efforts are successful. When centrist voices are stifled, everybody suffers. And we on the East Coast should finally learn our lesson about California. And here's the lesson. We tend to scoff at you initially. Have you heard what they're doing in California? And then you give it a few years, no-fault divorce, tax revolt, decriminalization of marijuana. the hula hoop, Van Halen, and now forcing the Republican Party to address the interests of centrists, independent thinkers, and those who want some evidentiary-based analyses. I sure hope you're successful. Thank you for having me.